Prairie can be beautiful in the winter, but you have to keep in mind that it can be extremely dangerous, especially when the blizzards come and go. He knew that when he left the warmth of that cabin and his wife and his 2 children. But he really didn't have a choice. They didn't have a choice. The Gardner family stood the risk of starvation if they didn't get some supplies. So in late February 1857, Harvey Luce and another settler by the name of Joseph Thatcher did something that was pretty brave. They hitched up a couple of oxen to a sleigh and they headed out for Waterloo to get supplies. I'm sure you remember Harvey. Harvey Luce was married to Abby's older sister, Mary. And Mary and Harvey had 2 children, Albert, age 3, and little Amanda, age 1. And they all lived together with the Gardner family in the one cabin. Although that's not totally accurate, because at the time that Harvey went to get supplies in Waterloo in February of 1857, Eliza was not living at home in the cabin. She had volunteered to go to the little settlement of Springfield, some 17 miles to the northeast, to help a doctor take care of the doctor's sick wife. And she had not been able to return home because of the weather conditions. So when Harvey began his journey to the east, to Waterloo to get supplies, he was leaving behind 3 adults, a 13-year-old girl, Abby, and 3 children under the age of 5. The trip to Waterloo, which was 150 miles away, had to be tough, over the prairie, through the snow. But Harvey and Thatcher made it, got their supplies, and turned around to go back to Spirit Lake. And then this happened. On the way back, visibility was 0 at times. They encountered snowdrifts as high as 12 to 15 feet. To put that into perspective, a basketball hoop is placed at 10 feet. Harvey and Thatcher didn't make it all the way back to Spirit Lake with the provisions. They got about 120 miles to Shipley's cabin, about 30 miles west of Spirit Lake. And there Thatcher stayed with the provisions for whatever reason. Maybe the oxen were exhausted, or maybe it was just too difficult to keep going. And Harvey continued on to Spirit Lake with 3 men, a man by the name of Jonathan Powell, Enoch Ryan, and another fellow by the name of Clark, who were interested in looking at the Spirit Lake area. The 4 of them continued on to Spirit Lake, and Harvey reached home on Friday, March 6, 1857. Although they must have been disappointed that Harvey was not able to get the provisions home, it was dangerous out there and they must have been worried about him. There had to be lots of hugs and kisses with his wife and his 3-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter in that little cabin that night. The next day, on Saturday, March 7, 1857, Inkpaduta arrived in Spirit Lake. This is probably a good time for a little recap on what Inkpaduta was all about. Over the last 30 years, he had seen his land taken away by the whites, a military force, an occupation force, taking hold in his country. Treaties signed, he never signed, but treaties signed giving their land away. A requirement that his people live on a small reservation in Minnesota. His brother, Inkpaduta, murdered, and then when he sought justice using the white man's law, it turned into a farce. His people starving, scarce game, mistreatment by the whites. And now, again, settlers, white settlers, taking, this time at Spirit Lake, a sacred land for the Dakota. If the settlers at Spirit Lake knew what we know now, they would have known that this is not going to end well for them. Inkpaduta set up his camp near the Maddock cabin, about a mile away from the gardener's cabin. James Maddock and his wife and their 5 kids lived in that small cabin, along with another man, Robert Madison, and his 15-year-old son. The size of Inkpaduta's band would ebb and flow at times, new people coming, others leaving. But at the time he arrived in Spirit Lake, it appears that he had about 50 to 60 people in his band and probably 10 lodges, 10 teepees. Inkpaduta had 2 wives, at least 5 sons. 2 of them were young and were twins, 2 daughters. His oldest children were warriors, Roaring Cloud, Fire Cloud, and 17-year-old Big Face. There were probably a total of 14 warriors with Inkpaduta at that time. That night, as the gardeners laid down to sleep, they heard the sounds of drums in the distance. That's the first indication they had that there were Dakota Sioux in the area. They clearly did not appreciate the fact that that is often something you would hear before the Dakota Sioux started a revenge raid, which is a serious, violent thing where everyone, including women and children, were fair game. The next day, March 8, 1857, Sunday, was to the gardeners the Lord's Day, and it was a good day. The sunrise was bright. It felt like the bitter winter might be coming to an end. The temperature was in the 40s. Roland woke up early to prepare for a trip to Fort Dodge. Given the fact that they did not get the supplies from Waterloo, he was going to go to Fort Dodge and get those supplies. Just as they were sitting down to breakfast, a Dakota man entered the house. He was acting in a friendly manner, claiming the sacred prerogative of hospitality. A place was prepared for him, and he ate a frugal meal with the family. He was soon followed by Inkpaduta and 14 warriors, all crowding into the cabin, along with some of their women and children. Some were left standing outside. There just wasn't enough room in the cabin. You can imagine how uncomfortably crowded that little cabin was. Everyone was standing basically shoulder to shoulder. This is the first time that 13-year-old Abby Gardner saw Inkpaduta. She must have been frightened. Later, she described him as 6 feet tall, strongly built, 50 to 60 years old. He was actually 42 years old, but a hard life, you know. He had a deeply pitted face and what she called a revolting appearance. To her, he was a, quote, savage monster in human shape. In the beginning, this encounter with Inkpaduta and his band was somewhat amicable. Roland and Francis gave them a number of household goods. But then Inkpaduta and the others became sullen, insolent, overbearing, and Inkpaduta demanded ammunition and some other things. Roland was giving one of the Dakota a few gun caps when that Dakota snatched the whole box from his hand. Another Dakota tried to grab a powder horn hanging on the wall, but Harvey stopped him. The Dakota lifted his gun and pointed it at Harvey's head, who seized the gun. Things were about to get completely out of control when 2 other settlers arrived at the cabin, Dr. Harriet and Mr. Snyder. They were bringing some letters they hoped that Roland would mail for them when he went to Fort Dodge that morning. Roland told them that he was not going to be going to Fort Dodge because, in his view, the Dakota were on the warpath. He told them they should warn the other settlers and come to the Gardner cabin to put up a defense. But Dr. Harriet and Mr. Snyder thought that the Dakota were just acting out and were not serious. So they actually did some trading with the Dakota, and then they returned to their own cabins. Both of those men would be dead before the end of the day. The Dakota prowled around the Gardner cabin till about noon, then left in the direction of the Maddock cabin, shooting the Gardner cattle as they left. Now Abby and her family, they were all alone. There was fear in that cabin. At about 2 p.m., they decided that Harvey would leave the cabin and go to the neighboring cabins to sound the alarm and to get help. Harvey took Clark with him. Clark is one of the 3 men who returned from Waterloo with Harvey, and apparently Clark was still at the Gardner cabin. As he prepared to leave, Harvey hugged his 2 small children, and as he hugged and kissed his wife, Mary, goodbye, Abby could hear Mary whisper into Harvey's ear the words, "I am afraid you will never come back to me." And Mary was right about that. About an hour after he left the cabin, Mary's husband, the father of Albert, age 3, and Amanda, age 1, was ambushed by the Dakota Sioux, and he and Clark were shot and killed, scalped, and left lying in the snow near the edge of the lake, where their bodies would be found long after the massacre. Back at the cabin, Mary and the other Gardners heard those shots, but could only hope that it did not involve Harvey. A short time later, the Gardners heard more gunfire, this coming from the direction of the Maddock cabin, only a mile away. They waited, hoping that Harvey would return. The sun was setting, shedding brilliant rays of light over the snow. Roland was nervous, pacing inside the cabin. He walked out the front door of the cabin, turned left, and walked to the corner of the cabin, looking over the meadow towards the Maddock cabin, a mile away. That's when he saw the 9 Dakota men coming towards his cabin, trudging through the snow over the meadow, looking menacing. Roland ran back into the cabin, and he tried to remain calm, in charge. After all, he was the father, but he didn't pull that off. He yelled out, quote, "We are all doomed to die." You can imagine 13-year-old Abby hearing that from her father. Roland wanted to bar the door and fight it out with the Dakota. He said that he would be able to kill a few of them with the 2 loaded guns that he still had in the house. Frances was a Christian woman, and she had not given up faith. She hoped that they would appreciate kindness and spare their lives. She said that if they have to die, let us die innocent of shedding blood. Afraid of what would happen to the family if he fought them and lost, Roland finally agreed, and he unlocked the front door. Roland told Abby to take one of the chairs, put it in the corner, sit there and stay quiet, and to hold the children. And Abby did that. She sat in that chair. She held 1-year-old Amanda in her arms, 3-year-old Albert on one knee, and her brother, 5-year-old Roland, on the other knee, and waited for the Dakota to arrive. Abby could see that her father and mother and older sister Mary were all scared, and Abby, She was petrified. Within a few minutes, the front door pushed in, and the 9 Dakota men walked into the small cabin. Abby remembered dark shadows, 9 of them, filing into that small little area within the cabin. They were grim-looking men. They glared at the Gardner family. They glared at Abby. They began demanding more supplies. As Roland turned his back to take some food off of one of the shelves, one of the Dakota raised his rifle and shot him in the back. He fell to the floor, dead, onto that precious red rug the family had brought all the way from New York. The shot must have been deafening in that small cabin, must have shocked the Gardner family. And then it became chaos. The warriors, the Dakota men, shouting war cries, screams from Francis and Mary. And Abby watched as her mother and older sister were pulled through the door out into the yard, and she could hear the violence out there. She could hear pleading and more screaming. She heard what she later found out to be her mother and sister bludgeoned to death by the Dakota using pieces of firewood. Then the Dakota came back into the cabin for the children. Her brother, Roland, age 5, and her nephew, Albert, age 3, both clinging to her, clinging to Abby. Amanda, age 1, tightly in Abby's arms. The Dakota took all 3 of those children, pulled those children away from her. They were screaming and crying. And as she sat in that chair, she saw the children taken outside, and she could hear the sounds of the Dakota Sioux using the same pieces of firewood bludgeon those 3 children to death. Little 13-year-old Abby Gardner sat in that chair in shock, unable to move, and watched the Dakota ransack the cabin. And then they came for her. This time, they didn't drag her out into the yard and kill her. They took her. Later in life, Abby had a painter chronicle what she saw when she left that cabin that night, when she was dragged away from that cabin by the Dakota Sioux warriors. It's hard to imagine the trauma involved in that. And when they were gone, when the Dakota Sioux had taken Abby into the woods, the silence at that cabin must have been deafening.